Hello and welcome back to Web Components Remote Conf. Apologies for that last session, Jen. The UI froze up me. This is what happens when you run code on top of a UI thread. You shouldn't do that. Shouldn't do it. We're on to our next talk with Thomas Wilburn. He's going to be talking about using custom elements in production. So I'm going to get out of the way and let you take it, Thomas.
Great. Thanks so much. Okay, so if we switch over to show my slides at the same time here, that'd be great. Excellent. Cool. So welcome to using custom elements in production. Who am I? My name is Thomas Wilburn. If you go looking for me, I'm at Thomas Wilburn pretty much everywhere on the internet. I'm a data journalist at the Seattle Times, so I'm not a developer on the content management system. I do work with them from time to time, but primarily what I do is I work on our interactive projects, our large enterprise stuff, and a lot of that means that I need to be able to develop things very quickly on a deadline, do so effectively, and one of the things that we've found is really helpful for that is using custom elements as a method of putting applications together and putting interactive stuff specifically together. So you're here at a conference about web components, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. Obviously, web components are primarily these four things, and there are other technologies that have introduced them. So these are not a new concept, and they weren't new for us. I had actually been using Angular a little bit before, but actually even before I had started using them at the Times, I was using them on a game called Guild Wars 2. I used to work at a company called ArenaNet. And like a lot of video games these days, Guild Wars 2 implements at least some of its user interface using an embedded web view. So you've probably heard that SimCity, for example, does this, some others, and then specifically in Guild Wars 2 are commerce components. So our trading posts in which people could talk to each other or could trade in from items back and forth, and also the gem stores, so people could actually buy stuff with in-game currency. That was all powered via a web interface. And one of our goals with this was to create interactions with the engine in an easy-to-use way. So for example, in this photo here, we can kind of see, I've got selected an apple pie. And that apple pie, we don't want to load that over the network. We already have that icon in the game pack file. So we want to just pull that out, and we want to call to an API that the game exposes to do that. But I don't necessarily want to write code where every single time that I load a new filtered list view of all of the pies, because obviously pies are what you would go looking for. I don't want to have to run that code every single time. And so what we started looking into, a very smart member of our team, this was 3 years ago, so this was pretty early on, started looking at web components as a way that in our templates, we could just declare, I want a GW2 item, here's the ID number, and it would take care of hooking into the engine so that it would load the asset, and it would also register for things like this hover effect that you see, so that in this case, you can see what this pie does. It adds nourishment for 30 minutes, which of course is what we wish pie would do as opposed to what pie actually does. So this was a really, really useful tool for us in the game. And when I came to the Seattle Times, part of what I was interested in was, could we have that same kind of like fluency of authoring on a deadline for a journalistic purpose? So web components at the Seattle Times. The Times, I'm proud to say, is one of the largest deployments of custom elements in the world. And that statement has an asterisk after it because that is a total lie, of course. These days, it's actually really funny. Since I first put together this slideshow, we're not even one of the largest media deployments because Google's AMP project, regardless of your feelings on it, one of the interesting things about it is that it's powered by custom elements. But we do use these things and have used them for over 2 years now in front of a general audience. So our target is Internet Explorer 10 and up. These are not technically savvy people. We're not a developer audience, and yet we use them, and they've worked really, really well for us. So it's something that I think we should be trying to put out there more, that these things are out there, they have been successful, and that we should be using them. And the reasons that we use components are fairly simple, right? They're reusable building blocks. But more importantly, They are simple domain-specific languages for non-coders, and they are not proprietary frameworks. And I think it's important to break those down just a little bit. The second item is really important, having simple languages, because I work with a team of people who are designers or who are slightly web savvy, but they're not JavaScript coders, right? They are, for example, our web producers. So they're capable of assembling a page, they can style things, but they're not going to be able to write a lot of code. And one of the really nice things about web components for us has been that it's allowed people like that to be able to put together simple interactive chunks of functionality. Simple bits of UI can be reduced to just HTML, and HTML is easy for them to learn to speak. So the learning curve there has been dramatically lower. And the second thing is that because there's not a proprietary framework, these things are really easy to interoperate with each other. And that's something that I'm going to come back to a little bit later. Our methodology for using these things in production, like I said, there are the 4 things that we tend to think of as web components. HTML imports, which I think despite the efforts of the Chrome team is probably dead on arrival. But then you've also got templates and shadow DOM and custom elements. We pretty much ignore all of those except for custom elements, which I think is probably actually the easiest thing to polyfill of the bunch of them. For Shadow DOM, we use less to create more carefully scoped CSS. For templates, we have our build system, and we package in templates either as template literals or we use really simple EJS templating. But what that does is it reduces our kind of failure surface, or the amount of polyfilling that we need, to just the bare minimum of what do we have to use to get these things running in front of people. And we have a template, actually, if you're interested, that's built on top of our news app template that we use to create these custom elements. So if you're interested in looking at something that you can use to create a self-contained kind of like demo element, that's one way to start. So let's take a look at some of these. Unfortunately, the main one that I want to show off usually is one that's invisible. Our site, if you've ever looked at the Seattle Times, which, you know, let's boost our page views just a little bit. You know, the Seattle Times is actually, it's a WordPress-based system. And my team doesn't build anything in it. So on a general basis, there's a lot of stuff that flows through here into our publishing system. We've got all these great stories. But then anything that we've actually built does not go into this. It would be terrible to try and develop any kind of software inside of WordPress. And so what we actually use instead is something called a responsive frame. And this is a really common tool. It's just an iframe that knows how big its content is. So we use that all over the site. It's used in all of our stories whenever we need to embed interactives, but it just looks like a piece of the page because it's just an iframe. So I'm going to skip that for now. We're going to move on to something else. Let's start with something fairly basic. Image sliders. This is something that we've used for several stories lately where we just want to be able to create a before and after image comparison. So for example, in this story on the Elwha River Dam, we need to make sure that you can see what it looks like before and after the dam was removed. So here's the before, here's the after. This image slider is really, really easy to put together, and part of the advantage of creating it as a web component is we can actually install this now from NPM, which is where we put all of our web components. And if I need to create something like this on a project, I don't rewrite any of that code. I just add this element to it, and it works. So we've used this for all kind of stuff. We've got it for Elwha. My other comparison that I really enjoy is this one here, a feature that we did on Felix, Felix Hernandez is the pitcher for the Mariners, the Seattle baseball team. And we've got partway down the page here, there's a slider. And I love this because it feels like a time lapse of moving to Seattle. Like here's the before, and then you move to Seattle, you grow a goatee, you get some really ugly tattoos, you join a CrossFit, right? But before and after, this is really, really easy for us to put together. It's as simple as doing an npm install. And then on the page, we take 2 images. We add alt text, because of course you want to be accessible, and you put them in an image slider. And the advantage of this is if the JavaScript kicks in, you get this great UI for comparing 2 things, a before and after of what South Lake Union looks like compared to 10 years ago, for example. But if it doesn't work, The fallback is really straightforward, right? I just get two images stacked on top of each other, and the reader still gets what they're looking for. So we're always interested in creating web components for production that can fall back in a graceful way if script doesn't load, or as I think Jake Archibald is fond of saying, you know, all of your users are without JavaScript until the page loads fully. So during the time when that page is still maybe loading deferred and async scripts and getting everything in order, they can still see all of that content. It still works for them. All right, so let's take a look at a second element that we've used in production multiple times, and this is our SVG Map. So we have an interesting problem. We use a lot of SVG at the times. Scalable vector graphics are amazing for doing data visualization because they give you this way to draw curves and shapes, and you can move things around and rescale. We've done a lot of stuff with them, particularly in the last few months, but the main problem is that there are three ways to get an SVG onto your page: the object tag, an image tag, and actually embedding it. Only the latter allows you to actually reach into the SVG DOM and manipulate it or alter it in any way. So you want to do that. But on something like an election page where we're loading many, many maps, and it's basically the same map, but we don't necessarily want to swell our page source by having to embed that SVG graphic multiple times into the page. And so instead what we do is we use this element to just load it as though it was an image, and we expose the same kind of interface that that image does. And then it also gives us a few utilities for working with those so that we can, for example, style that map and highlight counties that win a certain way on initiative measure 1401 or on 1366, for example. We can add hover behavior. And it caches each of those requests. So if I have 16 SVG maps on my page and they're all asking for assets/county map, it will make sure that that request is only made once, but then it will insert all of those into the DOM so that they can be manipulated later on. And it exposes its API so that I don't actually have to talk to the box of spiders that is the SVG DOM API. So this has been a really huge advantage for us. And we actually have one of these published to NPM right now. We have a suite of SVG tools. We call them the Savage things. So there's Savage Query, Savage Camera, and then Savage Image is actually this element basically, but packaged up on NPM. So we've got that. And then finally, actually my favorite of the three, and the one that I think really shows off the potential of using these things, is Leaflet Map. We build a ton of maps at the Seattle Times because when you're local news, people want to know where things happen and they want to color in or highlight particular trends that are local or geographic in scope. So the leaflet map is a really phenomenal way of taking the leaflet library, which is fantastic, but is cumbersome and requires JavaScript knowledge, and writing it in a way that actually doesn't require any JavaScript knowledge at all. So we've got here a map that's centered roughly on Seattle at 47-122. It's zoomed in a small amount. We're loading a tile layer from CartoDB, which is a mapping service. We're loading their positron layer, and so that's all built in. It'll handle loading the attribution, putting that onto the map. And we're creating a map marker that's right in the center, giving it an ID, and we're adding a pop-up content to it. So you're able to actually click on that, and you'll see whatever you put inside that element, which is a really wonderful way of being able to describe what you want to do, right? I've got something, I want to put content inside of it. Let's just use HTML. And then with this element, we can even load larger chunks of GeoJSON. So we can actually just put GeoJSON into this element directly, and it will parse that, work out how to style it, and it'll add it directly to the map. So we've used this on a ton of projects. We use this on an almost daily basis. We have a template that lets you create maps. But one of my favorite examples was this project where we followed our reporters on Twitter, and we had a bot that every time that they mentioned where they were during our annual May Day protest. And for those of you who don't know, Seattle does this thing every May Day. It's our holiday in which first we have a couple of peaceful protests for labor rights or the native tribes that are local. They will march in solidarity. And then in the evening, a bunch of anarchists go and set fire to things and the police tear gas them. So it's a fun time for everyone involved. But we sent out our reporters to follow those protests, and then as they tweeted on social media, we were able to pick up on that and add it to the map. And for me putting this together, it was as simple as adding those marker elements in my HTML. So it was very, very easy for me to template this as a part of my build process. But what I got spit out on the other side was a map that included all of the geotagging. And you could actually watch these protests happen in real time. So it was also looking at the data feed and pulling that in so that once you loaded this page, it would populate it itself from the web component and then use JavaScript to pull in the data. It's really helpful, a huge time saver for us. These maps expose a JavaScript interface on the element so that you can talk to them. So once you've used that element, you're able to get the instance of leaflet for creating new items. You're able to get the map so that you can manipulate it. And anything that you give an ID shows up on element.lookup. So for example, here, I have an ID called marked. That means that when I go to this interface, I can actually say map element.lookup.marked, and it will give me the instance of that marker on the map, so that if I wanted to open its pop-up or scroll to it or do anything with it, I could actually use that as a way to manipulate the data after it's been instantiated, converted from markup into a combination of new DOM elements and JavaScript objects. And then finally, sorry about the title, this is an old presentation, but this slideshow itself is actually a web component. So I wanted to kind of spend some time and build something and show this was something that you could use live. So let's actually take a look at what we've got here. If we inspect this, and I'll go ahead and throw this, well, we'll keep it here. So you can see, zooming in a little bit, inside of our body, we have a slideshow element. And inside of that, we have some text slides and some code slides. And inside of these, you can actually create, I'm using a very simple, it's not quite markdown, it's kind of like the world's crappiest markdown, basically. But those contents get turned into the slides for you. And the sources for doing this are relatively simple. I'm using the old, the document register element shim. But this would be relatively easy to build using the new V1 version of the custom element interface. So we load this up, we create the prototype, upgrade it, and then from each of these things, we try and set our attributes so that it's accessible. And then as we work through this, we dispatch events. So as multiple speakers have said, the interface for this tries to expose itself using primarily events and properties. So if you stick with the DOM for this particular element, it's relatively easy to go through and communicate with it or to get updates on it. So for example, the slides are actually they're the web component. But this UI here, these arrows, and this bar at the bottom are not. Those are actually created in the script.js, and so we just talk directly to this the same way we would any element. We listen for events. On those events, we go through and we call a function to set up from the events, like what index are you on, how long is the slideshow, and we're even able from there to listen for slide change events, for example. So if I were to go in and find the slide that I'm looking at in particular here, and then edit it, that works because we're watching the contents using mutation observers. We're dispatching events, and then we're just handling those and transferring them upwards. So the entire thing is packaged up in a way that integrates really, really nicely into a mixed framework environment, to be honest with you. That's one of the things that I want to talk about in terms of being in production. And it's one of the things that's actually changed really rapidly since the first time that I gave this talk at Cascadia.js and what's happened since then, which has only been, God help us, only like 4 months. Like I said, I built this on top of document register element. We're actually still using that throughout everything at the times. And there are a couple of reasons for that, but one is that we transpile everything. The new custom elements.define is, for the most part, similar, and in some cases an improvement, but it is a class-based syntax. We've found that it has been awkward to try and use that in an environment where we are transpiling, and particularly where we have to be compatible back to browsers that are not supportive of the class keyword. That said, the thing that I actually really like about web components is I have actually had a version of this slideshow running where we were mixing which ones we were using. So part of the slideshow was running with elements defined using register element. Part of it was running using elements defined using custom elements.define. And because they communicate using events and properties, they don't try and reach into each other. Unlike, say, Angular directives, they don't have an internal implementation that's like its own framework thing. Because they communicate in that way and not through outside channels, it doesn't matter, right? You can continue to use register element. We're continuing to use it in Chrome, even though it's been deprecated there and will be removed. It'll continue to work because the shim will continue to function. And meanwhile, as we transition over to custom elements, we will be able to mix and match those two things, and it can be a gradual process. So the way that I like to think of this is a little bit hipsterish, which I think is appropriate for Seattle. But when it comes to polyfills, you don't want to think that this is obsolete, right? Register element is not necessarily obsolete. It's vintage. It's trendy. So, you know, gradually we will update our style, but in the meantime, we've got this great thrift shop register element. We're gonna stick with that for a little while. So it's important to take a good look at the browser environment that you operate in and work out what the trade-offs that you're gonna operate under are, and whether you actually need to move fully into the new spec, whether you wanna use something like polyfill or a Polymer that's going to try and abstract some of this stuff out, or if you can actually stay on register element and just try and write your code so that it actually will work forward as much as possible once you get to be compatible with the V1 spec. So if you think that this is something that you're interested in doing, my advice for actually using this in production, first is to build small self-contained elements. So both at ArenaNet and at the Seattle Times, we have not tried to rewrite like everything on earth in terms of custom elements. It's good to start out relatively small. You know, we built thumbnails. We built the cash display for money in terms of your gold, silver, and copper inside the in-game currency. That was another custom element. But those were relatively small things. If they failed, it wasn't the end of the world. But they gave us a way to become comfortable and to start actually using that without having to impact an enormous amount of other code. And if we had another framework, we were on YUI at the time. Here at the Times, we use a lot of Angular and a lot of just vanilla JavaScript. We can mix and match those things as long as they're small. As they start to get bigger and become a system, that's tough to do. Work with the grain of the DOM. As long as you stick with properties and events and attributes is the way that your elements communicate with the outside world, it's going to be an easy transition, and it's going to work well with other libraries and other frameworks. Don't reinvent select boxes, just don't do that. And I think Jan's talk previous to this one was a good example of why. Like, there's a tremendous amount of complexity that goes into a lot of these browser components. And unless you're willing to tackle the accessibility problems, try and keep it to things that you would already have to bootstrap with JavaScript, or that you already know you can tackle in terms of the accessibility demands and the problems that you're going to face. And then finally, write with an eye on the V1 spec. And as far as I know, the differences have primarily been when you are allowed to add things to the DOM. In the V0 spec, you were allowed to initialize a component, and in its essentially in its constructed callback, you could start adding HTML. Then in V1, web components are expected to be empty until they are actually attached to the DOM. But that's really just a matter of creating an instantiation or construction method and calling it in response to a different callback. It's not a big deal. It shouldn't be something that holds you back. The other thing that is a big deal is the is attribute. And other people will have and probably have had a lot of things to say about that. If you're interested in using the is attribute, it is in the V1 spec, but Apple has basically decided to stonewall it, and we probably won't get it. So it's a decision that you have to make on whether or not you think it's worth trying to use that, if you know that it's going to have to be polyfilled even in browsers that support custom elements. Great. If you have any questions, I can take those now. Yes, Rob, definitely don't invent them. But also, so I can answer any questions now, or if you need to get in touch with me, this is my email address. And also, please feel free to follow up with me at any time. I'm more than happy to do that and to answer any questions about kind of the problems we've run into and how well it's worked out for us.
Thank you very much, Thomas. That as someone who was from Seattle, I understood most of the words you know. I spent a lot of time in Seattle, lived there for a while.
Sure.
You know, the riots. Yes.
It's a proud bonding experience for all.
Isn't it all? I remember smelling the tear gas from the dorms, as it were. Let's see. So we do have a couple questions here. So let's take one here before we move on to our final speaker of the day.
Okay.
Previous speakers had mentioned difficulties with browser support and polyfills, especially around Safari. Have you run into any problems deploying custom elements at scale?
We haven't run into anything. We're actually using, if you watch the first day of the conference, you remember Andrea Giamarchi. We're using his polyfill for it. So and it actually supports both the V0 and the V1. Like I said, we're only using the V0. But in general, we haven't run into, I mean, it always gets shimmed in Safari. That's just the way of the world until they do actually ship. I guess it'll be Safari 10. If it's not already in there, it will be. My main concern, so the main concern that we've had that has not turned out to be a concern is that the code's not optimized, right? Like using the shim means that you are going to patch the prototype of the element. And the real question that I really had was, would that be a problem? And it hasn't been. It would only really be a problem if you were creating an enormous number of elements and shoving them into the DOM. And I think that's something you should avoid probably doing anyway. So it hasn't been something that we really ran into. You know, I will keep an eye out as they roll out. Rob's saying that, yeah, it's going to be in 10.1, or 10.1 has it. We haven't seen anything yet, and I don't anticipate that we will. But our use is fairly small, and we have not made heavy use of like the is attribute for that reason. So I think we're going to be okay.
Yeah, is a bit of a sticky point. I know for a lot of folks. I know it was a topic of conversation yesterday here at the conference. So yeah, hopefully we'll get there someday. Finally, one more question real quick. Regarding the GeoJSON element, has JSON as tag content been a pattern that's been useful more than once? Can you comment sort of on the pros and cons of that strategy?
So I can comment. We've had one really amusing bug that came out of using JSON, and we've used this a lot. And part of it is because we have one graphics team member who builds a lot of our online maps. We try not to actually get the interactives team involved. And so the way that they'll do it a lot is we'll read in the JSON and then they just dump it straight into the template using an include. And the fun bug that we had was one day we had a map that would not work in Safari. And we found out that the reason why was because by default, Safari will try and parse HTML, even in non-visible elements. It'll try and parse it for phone numbers. And then it turns those phone numbers, and Chrome does not do this. So Chrome also has clickable phone numbers, but it doesn't alter the DOM to make that happen. It uses some sort of layer between the DOM and the touch layer. But Safari actually does mutate the DOM. And so we were finding that our GeoJSON was crashing because Safari was inserting links wherever it would see something that it thought was a phone number. So that was exciting. We now have a tag. There's a meta tag that you can add that will tell WebKit, please do not try and parse this page. And that's now a standard part of our embedded maps. I would say in general, like we've used that in a few places, and it's been a really natural use for Leaflet specifically, because Leaflet has a lot of, in addition to GeoJSON, there's a lot of configuration options, and those options, I wanted to just add them as attributes, but the attributes end up being case insensitive, and Leaflet is not. Leaflet expects configuration to come in and has case embedded in the config properties. So instead of trying to basically create a whitelist that would translate, you just put JSON into it like a map config element, and that's how you can configure things like, does it scroll when the wheel is used, or does it zoom? That's been fine in small doses, but I've actually tried to move away from it. Although the GeoJSON element does support embedding just a huge hunk of JSON into the page, I think that's a bad pattern. And we end up using it a lot on pages just because we do a lot of data visualization. But I mean, you're basically incurring like a big JSON parse penalty. And some of these GeoJSON files are really, really big. And our staff, if they're not web developers, if they're just using these naively, does not really think about page size. Like that's not a thing that is instinctive for them to check. And so I've seen them load like a 2 megabyte GeoJSON file directly into the HTML, and then it freezes the page to parse that. So what we did is we added support for a source attribute on the GeoJSON element, so that at the very least we can load that in, and it can be done on a callback and deferred instead of being done as the HTML is parsed. And then the other opportunity that you've got there is, although I guess it's not parsed right away, because as far as the browser is concerned, it's not JavaScript. But it's also ideal because then we could request it, it would happen deferred, and then I'd like to be able to actually do that parsing at some point in a worker and use transferables to send that back over to the browser as a complete object would be my preferred way of actually loading like really big GeoJSON files. So it's been interesting. I'm trying to move away from using it for bulk data, but I still actually think it is valuable when you're communicating with components. And it's something that I think a lot of people just haven't found a more elegant solution to, because you still see that a lot in, like I think I've seen that in Polymer, used a few places. I could be wrong, I haven't used Polymer extensively, but I think that's going to be a problem we have to solve coming down the pipeline, because I think that's one point where there's just an impedance mismatch between what the HTML API wants you to use and what JavaScript kind of expects in terms of style.
Yeah, no, it's GeoJSON is a very interesting sort of thing. I've had to deal with it myself, and yeah, it's great until it isn't.
Exactly.
Well, Thomas, thank you so much. If you have other questions for Thomas, feel free to continue asking them in the chat or in the Q&A section. We'll try to get those answered for you all. And we're going to head to our last sessions of the day with Rob, so we will see you very shortly. Again, thank you, Thomas.
All right, thank you.